The timing of this move is what really caught my attention. Nick Robertson didn't just leave the Toronto Maple Leafs. He didn't just sign a new contract with the Pittsburgh Penguins. He finally spoke publicly about the entire situation. And if you read between the lines, it's clear this wasn't simply about money. It was about opportunity. It was about trust. And maybe, just maybe, it was about proving that the Maple Leafs gave up on him too soon. Here's what I'm hearing around the league. People have viewed Robertson as one of the NHL's most intriguing change of scenery candidates for quite some time. The talent was never really the question. The question was whether Toronto could ever give him the role he believed he had earned. Now that chapter is officially closed. Robertson has signed a 2-year contract worth $6.5 million with the Pittsburgh Penguins, carrying an average annual value of $3.25 million. The deal also avoids salary arbitration, which tells me Pittsburgh didn't want this relationship to begin with a contract dispute. They wanted certainty, and more importantly, they wanted Robertson to know they believe in him. What makes this story even more interesting is who made it happen. Penguins general manager Kyle Dubas knows Nick Robertson better than almost anyone in hockey management. Dubas was the one who drafted Robertson in the second round back in 2019 when he was running the Maple Leafs. Back then, Toronto believed they had found one of the best pure goal scorers in that draft class. The skill was obvious, the release was quick, his hockey sense around the net stood out. There was genuine excitement that Robertson could eventually become an important offensive piece for the organization. But hockey careers rarely follow a straight line. Robertson's time in Toronto became a constant cycle of opportunities, setbacks, injuries early in his career, trips between the NHL and the American Hockey League, and long stretches where he simply couldn't establish himself as an everyday top six forward. Every time it looked like momentum was building, something seemed to interrupt it. Now here's where his recent comments become important. Robertson said he was excited to join Pittsburgh because it gives him a fresh start. He also made it clear that he appreciated everything Toronto had done for him during his development. There wasn't any bitterness in his words. There wasn't a public attack on the Maple Leafs organization. But sometimes what isn't said tells you just as much as what is. Here's how I read the situation. Robertson sounds like a player who finally feels somebody is investing in him instead of constantly asking him to prove himself again. Those are two very different environments for a young player trying to establish an NHL career. From what I've been told by people who have followed Robertson's development over the years, confidence has always been one of the biggest factors in his game. When he's playing freely and receiving regular minutes, he has the ability to score goals in bunches. When he's worrying about every mistake because his place in the lineup isn't secure, his game naturally becomes more cautious. That's one of the biggest criticisms some fans had of Toronto's handling of Robertson. They argue he never received an extended opportunity alongside elite offensive players. Instead, he often found himself moving around the lineup, trying to make an impression in limited minutes while competing with a deep forward group that already featured stars like Austin Matthews and William Nylander. Breaking into that group consistently was never going to be easy. At the same time, it's important to understand the Maple Leafs side of this story. Coaches have to trust players in all three zones. Scoring goals matters, but defensive responsibility matters just as much, especially for teams with Stanley Cup aspirations. Robertson's offensive talent has never really been questioned. The bigger concern inside hockey circles has been whether he could consistently earn coaches' trust away from the puck. People around the league have pointed to his defensive play, board battles, and overall physical game as areas that still needed improvement. At 5'9", Robertson has had to work incredibly hard against bigger NHL defenders, and while he never lacked effort, there were times when coaches appeared hesitant to give him expanded responsibilities in critical situations. Still, this past season gave everyone something new to think about. Robertson played 78 games during the 2025-26 season and finished with career highs across the board: 16 goals, 16 assists, 32 points. Those aren't superstar numbers, but they represent meaningful progress for a player who was finally staying healthy and contributing on a regular basis. Here's where I think the conversation becomes really interesting. If a young forward sets career highs while averaging relatively limited ice time, is that a player reaching his ceiling, or is that a player showing he might produce even more if given additional opportunity? That's the question Pittsburgh appears willing to answer. Kyle Dubas has now invested in Robertson twice during his career, first by drafting him, now by acquiring him from Toronto and quickly signing him to a new contract before arbitration became an issue. Those aren't the actions of someone taking a low-risk flyer with no expectations. Those are the actions of an executive who still believes the player has another level to reach. From what I'm hearing, Pittsburgh views Robertson as someone who can help reshape part of their forward group during this transition period for the franchise. The Penguins are balancing two realities at once. They still have veteran stars who expect to compete, but they also need younger players capable of becoming long-term contributors. Robertson fits that profile almost perfectly. Another detail that shouldn't be overlooked is the trade itself. Toronto moved Robertson in exchange for a 2028 fourth-round draft pick. Whenever a former high draft pick is traded for a future mid-round selection, fans naturally start asking whether the original team sold too early. That's exactly what's happening here. Leafs fans remain divided. Some believe Toronto made the right decision because Robertson simply wasn't going to climb higher on their depth chart. Others think the organization never truly gave him a consistent chance to show what he could become. My take falls somewhere in the middle. I understand why Toronto eventually made this move. Their roster is built to win now. Every lineup decision comes with enormous pressure. Coaches don't have unlimited patience when they're expected to contend every season. But I also understand why Pittsburgh sees an opportunity. Robertson is only entering the next phase of his career. He's coming off his best NHL season. His confidence appears high. And perhaps most importantly, he's joining an organization led by a general manager who has believed in him from the very beginning. That's a combination worth paying attention to because sometimes all it takes in the NHL is one organization seeing something another organization could no longer afford to wait for. What I'm watching now isn't just whether Nick Robertson scores more goals in Pittsburgh. I'm watching how much responsibility he's given from day one. That's where I think this story really begins. The latest information I'm hearing is that the Penguins didn't bring Robertson in simply to fill out the roster. They believe there's still offensive upside that hasn't fully been unlocked. And when you look at the circumstances, it's not hard to understand why. Throughout his years in Toronto, Robertson often found himself trying to earn more ice time while playing behind one of the NHL's deepest groups of forwards. That's the reality of joining a team built around established stars. Opportunities are limited, mistakes are magnified, and younger players sometimes have very little room to grow. It's a difficult environment, especially for a player whose biggest strength is creating offense. From what I've been told by people around the league, Robertson has always been respected for his work ethic. Nobody questioned whether he wanted to improve. The bigger question was whether the Maple Leafs could afford to keep waiting for every part of his game to catch up with his scoring ability. That's why this fresh start matters. A change of scenery in the NHL isn't just about putting on a different jersey. It changes expectations. It changes relationships with coaches. It changes the role a player is asked to play. Sometimes that's exactly what a young player needs. When Robertson spoke after signing his new contract, he didn't use the moment to criticize Toronto. Instead, he expressed appreciation for the organization and excitement about the opportunity ahead. I actually think that approach says a lot about his mindset. Rather than looking backward, he appears focused on proving himself going forward. Here's how I see this situation. Players rarely forget the teams that drafted them. Toronto gave Robertson his first NHL opportunity and invested years in his development. At the same time, competitors also remember every moment when they felt overlooked. Those experiences have a way of fueling players long after they've moved on. That's one reason I think the games between Pittsburgh and Toronto will become must-watch hockey. Whenever Robertson faces the Maple Leafs, there will naturally be extra attention. Fans will compare every goal he scores, every strong performance, and every stretch of success against what might have happened had he remained in Toronto. Now, is that entirely fair to the Maple Leafs? Probably not. Roster construction in today's NHL is incredibly complicated. Every organization has salary cap limitations. Every team has players competing for the same positions. Sometimes a trade doesn't happen because a player lacks talent. Sometimes it happens because both sides simply need a different path. That's why I don't believe this has to be viewed as one side winning and the other side losing, at least not yet. Toronto received a future draft pick and opened additional flexibility within its roster. Pittsburgh acquired a player they believe can contribute immediately while still having room to improve. Whether that becomes a brilliant move or simply a solid one will be determined over the next 2 seasons, not over the next 2 weeks. Still, I understand why emotions are running high among Leafs fans. Robertson wasn't just another prospect. For years, he represented the possibility of internal development. Fans watched him dominate junior hockey. They watched him battle through injuries. They watched him fight for NHL opportunities. Naturally, many hoped the payoff would eventually come in a Toronto sweater. Instead, that next chapter will now unfold in Pittsburgh. And here's another angle I think deserves more attention. Kyle Dubas has now reunited with a player he originally drafted. That isn't something general managers do by accident. When executives spend years evaluating prospects, they develop strong opinions about which players can still take another step. Dubas has now acted on that belief twice.